Your stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and Chief Storymaker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, and to connect. What we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're perceived by the people you're interacting with. In this series, you hear stories that will resonate with you, and you'll nod your head in understanding, and then we'll dig into some of the lessons from those situations. When I'm working with clients on communication skills, I remind them to listen for understanding, not necessarily to respond. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen and consider your related stories, to consider which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. This podcast features Jennifer Heflin, an incredibly insightful writer and personal development coach. Please feel free to connect with her on LinkedIn and check out her website, angelsevolution.com. Both links can be found on the blog post associated with this podcast at elkinsconsulting.com. Hi, Jennifer. Thank you so much for joining me on my podcast today. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited.
So for our listeners, I met Jennifer Heflin on LinkedIn a few years ago, and we connected on a pretty deep level because, like so many of my other connections on LinkedIn, her real energy goes toward improving our environments in business and at work. So some people call it a human workplace, which every place is a human workplace, for better or for worse. But the question is, how do we change that environment throughout our communities so that we recognize the humanity behind the people that are doing things at work? So Jennifer, the way I always start these podcasts is I ask the question, tell me something about yourself that I wouldn't see on your resume or on LinkedIn.
Okay. Well, I could say that one thing that I love to do, which you would not necessarily see on my resume, on my CV, or on LinkedIn, is that I love to build. So, for example, I basically redid our entire mudroom with, I put up molding and I did all the woodworking for it. And
wow.
So that's something different.
Yes. And that's not something I would have predicted that you would tell me. So that's very cool. So do you use like all the power tools? You have the whole setup, the woodworking setup with the compound miter saw and the router and.
Yes. Home Depot is my home away from home.
My
dad actually borrowed my miter saw the other day, and he's like, I cannot believe you have a miter saw. And I don't.
I love that. I'm finding more and more women that I talk to are doing those things. And that makes me so happy. It makes me really happy, partly because our house was built in 1890. It's a Victorian in the mountains of Helena, Montana. And whenever my husband leaves for any length of time, I always take on a project in the house that I've been waiting for him to do. And I realized shortly after the first or second one that I do it when he leaves, because then he can't tell me what to do or how to do it.
Absolutely. I knew exactly where you were going with that.
And one of the first ones I did was a huge drywall patch. And the wall is all lath and plaster. So it was pretty tricky, but I did it. It's not perfect, but it's done.
Perfection is not necessary. Perfection is not.
So what's your favorite thing about that? Is it when it's complete and you walk in and you say, I did that?
I would say the process itself, I kind of lose myself. You've heard of Stephen Kotler talk a lot about flow states.
Mm-hmm.
I find myself in a flow state when I do that.
So it kind of clears your head. You get very present.
Yes.
And mindful.
Time
you have to be.
You stand still. You do. And it is, even though there are parameters to it, it's a form of expression and creativity. So there's that too.
Of course. Yeah. I love that. Well, thank you for sharing that. What about me?
What about you in those, when you do those projects, do you find yourself going into that?
It depends on the project. We built 2 very large raised beds out of bricks and mortar. And I had our two boys and my husband do all the digging to do the base, the foundation of it. But I did all the bricks and mortar myself. And there were times when I was definitely in a flow state when we figured out that rather than me having to get up and down and reach into the wheelbarrow for more mortar, my husband would dump it out onto a big piece of cardboard so I could slide it with me so I wouldn't have to reach my arms up. Mm-hmm. And that way my knees and hips didn't ache at the end of the day. And that was really pretty amazing. And yes, definitely, I got into a flow state because I knew what I was doing and I got into this rhythm. Mm-hmm. And as much as I enjoyed that, I have to say, when I walk up my front pathway or when I'm inviting guests into my home and they see these beautiful brick raised beds with all the flowers in them that mm-hmm. match my house, there's definitely a sense of pride when I think, I did that. I built that myself with my own hands.
Yes, absolutely. There's certainly something to be said for that.
Very satisfying.
Yes.
Very satisfying. Well, let's get into the meat of the podcast. And okay. The reason I invited you to talk about this topic is because all of the posts that I've seen of yours and the content that you share, which is mm-hmm. always insightful, are really about this optimism in business and the ability for us as people who want to see humanity in our workplaces. That just brings me to a sense of hope that sometimes it's easy to get cynical about what's going on, particularly because of the polarization of our communities. So I invited you because I would love to hear a story about what turned you to this topic. What specifically, and I know at the time it probably, you didn't know it, but I'm sure that there was a moment, an event, a conversation that light bulb went on. Oh my gosh, I need to do something about this, and I have the capacity to do it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I would say the first moment of recognition that this might be a theme in my life is when I was probably in high school. It was that time frame, and I remember one night in particular. I'm one of three girls. My mom and my sisters and I were sitting down eating. And of course, my father wasn't home because he was staying late at the office working. And he came in the door looking truly exhausted, mind, body, and spirit. And my sisters and I had just finished cleaning up, and, we were sort of ushered out of the room so my father could just sort of sit down, relax, talk to my mom, and have the leftovers. And I kind of lingered near the kitchen to hear what was going on. And because I was worried about my dad. And, I heard them talking about a situation in which my father couldn't actually progress in the way he wanted to in the firm that he was working for at the time because he wasn't cutthroat enough. It was very clear from their conversation that integrity and compassion and morals and values, which, you're not willing to compromise, wasn't something that was going to get you ahead. And at the time I was thinking to myself, so you cannot be kind and be in the business world. You have to have this conquering, kill or be killed attitude. That was the takeaway. And I thought to myself, that doesn't make sense to me. Right. But at the time I didn't think, I definitely am going to grow up and change that. That didn't occur to me. I just thought, okay, well, that's the way it is. It doesn't feel right to me. I don't understand it, but that's the way it is.
So what happened after that? Did you talk to your dad at all about it, or did you just kind of walk away and process?
I just walked away and processed. I remember maybe having a brief conversation with my mom about it, but she just reiterated what I already heard them discuss, mm-hmm. Which was that it's a shame because you have to be manipulative and controlling and
Aggressive.
this aggressive to actually, thrive in this particular company.
Was he an attorney?
No, business, mortgages.
Oh, mortgage. Oh, yeah. That can be and continues to be in some places a really ugly part of real estate.
Yes, it really does. It's been a common theme, hasn't it?
It has, especially in the last 15 years, I think.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. So, were you working at the time? Did you have a job?
At the time, I was a lifeguard at the local pool.
My husband did that as a teenager too. And had you had any experience like that before that or during that time?
Well, no, I wouldn't say that, but I guess you could see that, a little bit, not necessarily from the business side of things, but from the personal side of things, maybe like in education, in high school, in terms of, sort
Yes.
of that
The qualities that were being encouraged.
Yes.
Right. I could see that. We don't even have to go any deeper than that. So tell me about how that applied as you started getting into the business world when you grew up, left the house and started getting real jobs.
It's interesting because you would think that I would have honed my skill set to match that, but I never did. And, I did okay. I mean, I did fine. And I went to Wharton Business School. Like I walked the walk, but only to an extent because I just don't have it in me to acquire that skill set. Like it's so oppositional to who I am that I wouldn't even know where to begin. That was the issue. And so how did I end up in the business world knowing that my personality wasn't a fit? Well, that's part of the reason probably why I resigned after my second was born. I knew that there was something else coming, right?
That's really interesting that you had this insight as a teenager, and instead of saying I wanted to, be myself and carry my values into whatever I do, you as a young teenager thought, well, I guess I'm just going to have to develop those skills and be aggressive and manipulative and ambitious in a greedy way, in a power way, in order to do things and be successful.
I thought that was the only way.
That is a really interesting concept.
It's all that I saw.
Right.
I saw nothing else. And for some reason, that worldview or I accepted it instead of saying, I'm going to take this on and I'm going to change things just by my, my presence and my knowing that things can be different. But I couldn't conform. I went through it and I conducted myself still in a manner that I could live with, but I never tried to change anything.
So what was the story? What was the event? Because I have a few that light bulb went on.
So this is the moment that actually sticks with me the most, although I agree there's definitely more than one in my experience as well. But this one had the most impact on me. And I remember it was early in the morning. I hadn't gotten the kids up yet for school. I was in our home office and the windows were open. The birds were singing. The flowers were blooming. It was this time of year, the springtime. And the fresh cut grass was wafting in through the windows. And I suddenly had this overwhelming sense of joy just start to inundate my body. I mean, it started in my heart and burst outward. Now, keep in mind, I had resigned from Wall Street, and I had, I was already well on my way on this path of personal development, examining my belief systems, choosing new ones, meditation, mindfulness. So I was already doing things in my life that were facilitating expansion. But I remember in that moment, that feeling of joy in my heart, it burst out and spread throughout my body. And I felt so peaceful and joy-filled. It wasn't like I was feeling happy. I was receiving joy. I was receiving happiness. It was in me. And I remember looking around and the walls were pulsing and everything looked brighter and everything looked like there was so much. All I could feel like, I felt like everything was just oozing potential. And it occurred to me in that moment that maybe this path that I had been on just for my own personal expansion would be something that I could apply to the business world. And that the worldview that I had held onto so tightly, that this is the only way you can conduct yourself in the business world and be successful, it's just one perspective. And that when you expand your worldview and see what else is possible, you realize that truly anything is possible if you choose it. That was sort of the beginning. That's what really started me on this path in earnest about applying personal development to the business world.
Wow. I love that. The walls were oozing potential. That is such a visual contradiction.
Exactly. It was, and I think that's why I saw those pulsating walls. Like, these are not real, these are walls that you construct, and you can also choose to take them down.
Yes, I love that. I mean, oozing is not a word I would think of in like a really positive, optimistic, beautiful way, but that's why the contradiction is so important, because business is a contradiction. It can be. And that just makes so much sense that you had that moment of clarity.
Yes. And I think that was sort of my first moment of clarity. And then there were subsequent ones that maybe there wasn't any oozing going on, but it felt very expansive.
So I'm guessing that you were able to apply that not too long after that. Is there a specific time that you could see that when you shared that somebody else's light bulb went on? I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but.
No, not at all. I put together a post on LinkedIn at some point about, alluding to the quantum business model, what I call the quantum business model, and just emotional maturity being the basis for humanity's way forward. And the responses, although, some people still have trouble seeing that as a definite, whereas I'm already there. In my mind, this is happening. They're open, but they're very open to it, and they're excited about that potential. Hesitant because, and rightly so. I mean,
because it's different. It's a big shift. It's a whole shift, right?
Yeah. It is.
So you posted something on Facebook, and did somebody?
Oh, sorry. It was on. It was on LinkedIn.
Oh, LinkedIn, right?
I posted on my blog and on LinkedIn, and I did have a response. Many responses that were very positive. Very, I'm thinking along the same lines. So, it's clearly, seated within the collective. Like, there are definitely people out there that are thinking along these lines and taking action based upon these lines of business can be different.
So that's when you realized that your message was resonating and that you were on the right path.
Exactly.
Posting that on LinkedIn and having people respond.
Yes.
Did anyone reach out to you specifically that you remember that you were pleased or found some confirmation with?
Well, I would say I'm not very surprised by this, but Mike Johnson, of course.
Of course. For our listeners, if you haven't read Mike Johnson's writing, he is a contradiction in genes. Yes. Living in Cody, Wyoming. And I don't know that there's anyone that I could appreciate more for his contradiction that he is, and his writing is just terrific. His last post about that he nearly bought the Field of Dreams, that farmhouse, was just fantastic. So I'll put a link in the blog post associated with this podcast.
I haven't read it yet, but I can't wait to.
It was great. It definitely got me thinking again about things like this and the games that we play that we don't necessarily have to play unless we want to.
Yes.
So that makes a lot of sense that Mike responded, said, you don't have to play that game. We can do things differently.
Yes. Yes. And, he's the poster child for that, but that's the person that actually, I think sticks out in my mind the most. And I also, just doing research on the topic, find more and more resources and discussions. And, you're on Medium.
Yes.
Tons of conversations like this are happening. Michael Haupt I think he's from South Africa, Haupt. He is really, he calls himself, I think, a strategic project visionary, and he's putting together something called Project 2030. And he is really coming up with some very interesting strategic visions about not just business, but all of our systems. How are we going to move from where we are now to where we're going? Because to create anything, doesn't have to be, this is the way it's going to be, but a vision, a general vision to follow is really important.
Right. And it has to be a shared vision. And it doesn't have to be specifically shared, but just the idea of being able to reduce greed as a motivator.
Yes. That's a big one.
It is. So this brings me back and oh my gosh. When I was in college, I studied at Colorado State University in Fort Collins in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And I was in an ethics and business course. It was a summertime course. It was one of my last ones. And I was in this class with a guy named Michael Thornton. And we would get into these big arguments about ethics and business. Mm-hmm. And people loved it. And sometimes I think our professor actually would encourage our little conversations.
Yes.
They would get pretty heated. But I would say that businesses need to be conscious, socially conscious, just for the sake of being socially conscious. Absolutely. And he would say, well, they have to have a profit or they don't stay in business. And we would get into these arguments about consciousness for businesses and what that means, understanding why it's valuable. And I would say, let's say you're doing it because you know that your potential audience will appreciate it, and so you're going to get more sales. That may be your initial motivation, but there has to be more to it. And once you see that success, maybe businesses would be more apt to try these things out. And we'd get into these knockdown arguments, and the rest of the class would be laughing hysterically. We became such good friends over the years, and I'm still very close with him. And he is
cool.
Yes, and he is a huge advocate for corporate responsibility and social responsibility in business.
Isn't that funny?
And I just adore him. He's just a fantastic guy. And so what I'm thinking, the reason this popped into my head is that way back then, people were already starting to talk about this. They were starting to talk about what that means, what it looks like, and how to make something change, how to make this change. But what I think is, as Malcolm Gladwell would put it, the tipping point that we're heading toward is the fact that our global communities are reaching out to each other in unprecedented abilities to communicate, which takes into account your conversation with this man in South Africa and connections all across the US, millions of people actually being able to talk to each other and create that tidal wave of change.
Yes.
That just makes me feel very optimistic.
Absolutely. And there are so many drivers right now for change. I mean, I don't need to go through the negative side of things, if you will, but we are at a point where capitalism isn't really working for us anymore. And I think we have used all of the resources on the planet, and we're at a point where it's sort of an existential imperative to head in the other direction.
The pendulum swinging back.
Yes. And then you're having, the millennial generation alone is a huge catalyst because they don't have the same morals and values. They don't have the same ethos about business,
consumerism.
Exactly.
They're totally different from previous generations in terms of needing to own and buy things.
Absolutely. And they're motivated more by the intrinsic items such as, personal growth and, just giving back to the community and feeling like you're making change in a really positive way rather than status and money and things.
That's what I'm seeing as well. And I've been fascinated by the stories of Applebee's. I don't know if you've kept up on that. There are Applebee's across the country that are going out of business because this younger generation doesn't eat out as much. And when they do, they're focused on local, small, hole-in-the-wall style, family-owned restaurants. So Applebee's across the country are shutting down, and all of these folks from my generation and older were complaining about millennials causing, these companies to go out of business. And all I could think was, but it's not as if Applebee's is really socially or environmentally conscious. They don't necessarily pay their employees what they need to live. And so why would we continue to support a company that doesn't pass that gut test?
Absolutely.
I love it.
Oh, I do too. And this is the way, and I think you paint such a beautiful picture of how it just also happens so naturally. It's just a natural attrition to what is no longer serving us and a building up of what is. I think that is somewhat a natural process. Of course, there's action to be taken, but I think that story illuminates it about Applebee's for sure.
Yeah, I'll have to see if I can find a link to that so that our listeners can check on that and see what it was. That I know a lot of people were following that story, and it was among other companies, big box store type companies and franchise restaurants that are going out of business as a result of the change in consumer activities and preferences. There are a lot of us that won't shop certain places because we don't agree with what they do politically or economically.
Absolutely. And
I know I'm not the only one, that's what I mean by this whole tidal wave of people choosing to do the right thing.
It really is. That's exactly, the end users, the consumers, the clients are making decisions about their purchases based on the coherence and integrity and transparency of the companies they're doing business with.
Absolutely.
And that's a whole new thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's very new. I think it's just more I think more people see it now and are understanding that they do have a role in it. There was a time when we would think we didn't have any choices. We didn't have a way
That's
of making our
true.
voices heard.
Yeah.
But I think it's always been around. I think the community was smaller because our planet was smaller in terms of population.
Yeah.
But I think because people are seeing that when we can just go right back to the whole idea that the role of influencers, the people who are influencing, are changing so dramatically. It used to be a celebrity thing, a status thing. And now anyone with a sense of humor and ambition can get a YouTube account and start influencing. And all of a sudden, this person from Norman, Oklahoma is a big influence and starts telling people, the nastiness of a certain company and what they're doing. And suddenly there are people boycotting that company. And so I think that has a lot more to do. I think we've always been around people like us, who actually shop with our conscience has always been around, but this is definitely different.
Yeah, it's spreading.
The scale.
Well, and I'm on the East Coast, the Northeast, right outside of New York City. So I'm not sure that there was, with the people, especially on Wall Street that I was talking to, conscious capitalism was not a thing yet.
Right.
So part of it is also just where you live, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
But when I found out it was a thing, I was really excited.
Yeah. And that's what has to spread. We have to tell people you're not alone in your desire to make these changes and to influence others to positively impact your community. So I'd love to wrap up with another story. And you mentioned something when we emailed about you doing this podcast interview. You mentioned that you had something about your success in applying these lessons.
So I would say that essentially, it opened me up to a more expansive view. And I began to be able to sit down and really understand some much more like esoteric and complex topics. The more that I worked with these personal development tools, such as the mindfulness and the meditation and the yoga and the belief systems, and that has, I've had people reaching out to me, and I'm discussing topics that I actually didn't know anything about, but I sat down and did some quick research about them. And, I feel like there's a cognitive difference in my work since that moment. And then this ongoing personal development journey my own personal one. And I just love that because I know that all of these tools can be applied to employees, and you're not only investing in your employees, but you're also, you have a company of happier, more peaceful, just more fulfilled human beings, which can't help but add to the work environment and make that company more successful. It's just a natural course of things. So I would
definitely.
So it's an ongoing journey, but I love where it's going. And I think that humanity has just so much potential. It really does.
I agree. And what you're saying is it complements what I do in terms of the storytelling workshops for communication. It really complements that. And I recently did one where I was working with a small team with a health insurance company health insurance company. And we were drawing out the stories of the people around the table. And at the end, the person who hired me came up and gave me a hug. And he said, what was great about this is that I'm hearing these people that normally don't share a lot and are kind of quiet. And they're sharing these personal stories, which makes me feel like I know them better. And I feel like I can motivate them more because I know them better and I know how to encourage them to be productive. And he immediately understood, this is somebody who wasn't all that sure about hiring me for this purpose. But almost immediately he understood that um, having employees who have personalities and knowing
Yes.
those personalities
Yes.
can help leaders engage with their employees and can help the employees engage with their leaders if they know how to tell their stories. Then because it's just as much the employee's responsibility to be engaged as it is for the leader's responsibility to engage their employees.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that's something my friend Jeff Eichler works on, is helping people understand their role in being engaged at work if they're not their own boss. And what you said just resonated so strongly with me because of that recent interaction when that leader suddenly understood that having a human workplace, having a place where people feel comfortable to share, was going to improve his business.
Yes. What a story.
It's
That's
huge,
wonderful.
Isn't it?
Yes.
It's hopeful.
It's very hopeful. And yeah, I mean, we're just going to keep collecting those stories until all of a sudden we just have a whole new landscape, a whole new business landscape where we'll say, do you remember when we used to talk about what it would be like one day? And here we are.
Right. I hope you're right, Jennifer. I would like to see that in my lifetime for sure.
Me too.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast recording. It's been
Thank you so
nice.
much for having me.
Oh, I have been wanting to do this for a while, so it's really good that I finally got you on here. And I love to do these when it can be a spontaneous decision to do them. So for our listeners, I will have a link to Jennifer's LinkedIn profile, and we'll tell you a little bit more about Jennifer in the blog post associated with this podcast. So thanks so much for listening, and thanks for joining me, Jennifer. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Sarah. Have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Now listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell?